thought JJK was a roller coaster before Chapter 264, then boy oh boy do I have news for you. It just got bumpier, because Chapter 264 was a bit like watching your worst three-point shooter line up to take a big game-winning three and yelling no, 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 until it swishes. I mean, this chapter had genuinely everything. Like really, if we're playing the JJK Sukuna Cycle bingo card, you would have yelled bingo. Because this chapter had a Black Flash, it had Sukuna recovering his RCT, it had Sukuna taking an attack he probably shouldn't, it had one of the Kusakabe coalition taking what could be a deadly shot, and last but not least, it had a completely unexpected ending that truly could signal the end for Sukuna. So yeah, pretty much everything that we've seen in the last 50 chapters was boiled down and put into a concentrate drip and force-fed to us over the course of 20-ish pages. And if getting high on your own supply is a sin, then this chapter is a sin. Because, after all, since this chapter has checked every possible box of the Sukuna Cycle bingo card, whether you're upset with it or adore it is really up in the air. Because the only way that I can find myself feeling about this chapter is mixed, but also excited. It's like a healthy, racemic mix of anger and excitement. And if that's not a perfect explanation of the last 45 chapters of JJK, I genuinely do not know what is. And thus, quite obviously, we have a lot to talk about today. Whether it's breaking down everything that happened in this chapter, or theorizing about what could come next, Chapter 264 has brought us about as much to talk about as any chapter in the almost 50 chapters long Sukuna battle. And thus, we should get right into it, because today we're talking Chapter 264 of JJK Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're feeling generous and want to try to see me bring real-life challenges to the anime world, go ahead and follow the brand new project that I created with Stephen He, Chris Barnett, and Danny Mata called Anime IRL. Or if you just want to hear me talk about anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, The Talkers Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And I apologize if I sound weird. It's early, and I'm very sick. But as an honorary member of the Kusakabe Coalition, I don't stop until the Sukuna Cycle does. Which means I got some work ahead of me, apparently. Because while this chapter definitely could have spelled the end for Sukuna, of course it didn't. I don't know why I deluded myself into thinking that Angel's Jacob's Ladder would work now the third time. In fact, I don't know why I deluded myself to thinking anything will work against Sukuna. Ever. Because at least in most chapters, Gege is nice enough to explain to us why certain things don't work against Sukuna. But in this chapter, all we got was a,
oh, I guess it ain't gonna work.
Which I fear I may be dealing with for the rest of my life at this point, as we have now been fighting Sukuna for over a year. I'm so tired. But the videos do quite well, so I'm not complaining. So, Chapter 264 starts off where Chapter 263 leaves off. No flashbacks, no nothing. In fact, we haven't had a flashback in 3 or 4 chapters, so we're heading in a positive direction. We do have a flashback this chapter, and it is of Gojo. So, for all of you, it's not Gojo. For fans out there, it really isn't, because he won't stop showing up. But we're not quite there yet. So the chapter opens with a page cut into 4 panels with the eyes of the 4 participants in the end game of this Sukuna battle. And those 4 people, in order from top to bottom, are Angel, Sukuna, Yuji, and Todo. And the editor's note to open the chapter is Angel's Jacob's Ladder rains down on Sukuna. And, it kind of is. See, because right before the Jacob's Ladder rains down on Sukuna, the first thing we see Sukuna do is punch the ground real hard. Now, apparently Sukuna punches the ground so hard that he flings different sized debris all the way up to Angel. And all this debris is rather conveniently in a very scalable orientation. That is to say, a bit like, oh God, what was the game? You were the little elephant thing and you could shoot little beads out of your, oh, now I'm spacing what that's called, trunk into the monsters above you, and you had to hop all the way to the top, and they had little whirly hats and jetpacks. I'm showing my age here. It was like literally the first mobile game ever on iPhone. Anyways, needless to say, Sukuna creates a field of debris within the capacity of the Jacob's Ladder that he is now able to jump up. Or at least that's his plan for firing the debris above his head. And that's what Sukuna begins to do. He begins to jump off piece of debris to climb up Jacob's Ladder, which, no idea why he can do that. Well, some form of explanation is given in a little bit, and we'll get into that explanation when we get to that point in this chapter. But obviously, Hana, who just fired her strongest ability that's supposed to destroy Sukuna at Sukuna and hit him dead on, is a bit alarmed when she sees that Sukuna not only had time to fire up debris into the air, but also was so unaffected by her technique that he's able to scale from piece of debris to get up to her to incapacitate her. Because, yeah, I'd be concerned too. We've seen this technique used against Sukuna twice. The first is when Hana hit a newly formed Mikuna with Jacob's Ladder, and it was so powerful that it literally began to burn his skin away. Sukuna had to plead with Hana, pretending to be Megami and pretending that this Jacob's Ladder was hurting Megami to get this technique to stop. Now, the rationale as to why that Jacob's Ladder was so incredibly powerful against that version of Mikuna is because that version of Mikuna was newly formed. That is to say that at that moment in time, Sukuna had the least possible control over Megami's body, and thus at that moment in time, Jacob's Ladder stood the greatest threat against Sukuna. The second time that we saw Sukuna hit with this technique was within Yuta's domain, as the innate technique that Yuta applied to his domain expansion was Jacob's Ladder. And thus in the moment that Sukuna had to finally drop his wicker basket, he was hit with a maximum output Jacob's Ladder. And that was so powerful that when it hit him, it immediately burned and stunned him, creating an opening for Yuji to fly in and attack the barrier between Sukuna and Megami's souls, allowing for Yuji to try to rouse Megami. Now, the key thing to take away from both of these experiences with Sukuna getting hit by maximum output Jacob's Ladder is that in both circumstances, it was so devastating to him that he couldn't move, that he simply had to stand there under the weight of this incredibly powerful curse technique and burn away. And ironically, the reason given as to why this technique was so incredibly powerful against Mikuna in the first place was because the less control Sukuna has over Megami's soul, the stronger this curse technique is going to hit him. And therefore, the higher the likelihood that this curse technique will be able to strip Sukuna away from Megami's soul. To which some of you who have been paying attention to these breakdowns might say, but oh, doesn't Sukuna have like the weakest control of Megami's soul he's ever had right now? And the answer to that question is yes. It was established literally last chapter that Yuji has literally narrowed down the target of his dismantle to only focus on the barrier between Megami and Sukuna's soul. And thus in all other capacities, his dismantle is relatively useless unless he's hitting Sukuna. Kind of like the Nen restriction that Kurapika made on himself to only use certain Nen chains on members of the Phantom Troop, which makes Kurapika's Nen chains infinitely more powerful against members of the Phantom Troop. And with that highly specific and highly powerful technique, Yuji landed multiple blows against Sukuna that did so much damage to his control over Megami that he literally threw up multiple fingers. And yet now Sukuna, who's in this state of barely being able to control Megami, is climbing a maximum output Jacob's Ladder.
Oh, but Nick, he hit a black flash last chapter.
Yes, of course he hit a black flash last chapter. He does it every chapter, and this chapter is no different. In fact, every first punch that Sukuna has landed for the last 20 chapters has been a black flash. That's not 100% accurate, but it's closer to 100% accurate than you might think. But Nick, why is Sukuna able to climb this maximum output Jacob's Ladder? Surely Gege gave us a great reason. Not really. See, because Sukuna, while jumping up these rocks, doodle jump, explains to us, with his thoughts, that unlike in Yuta's domain, where Jacob's Ladder was applied to the domain as an innate sure hit technique, this Jacob's Ladder isn't solely focused at him, and thus this Jacob's Ladder will affect Todo and Yuji. Now, considering the fact that Todo and Yuji aren't cursed spirits taking over somebody's body, this pillar of light, as Sukuna refers to it, shouldn't affect them nearly as much as it affects Sukuna. However, the reason that Sukuna is saying this is because Sukuna believes, since this is affecting everybody, he'll be able to scale the pillar of light uninterrupted. That is to say that Sukuna is saying that since Todo and Yuji are also being pressed down by this pillar of light, he should be able to climb it uninhibited, because surely he's the only person who can climb this pillar of light, even though he's the only person who shouldn't be able to climb this pillar of light. The reason he wants to be able to climb this pillar of light is because he wants to be able to get to Hana and kill her without any interference. And boy oh boy, does he get to Hana with like next to no consequences. Like, he doesn't even look more damaged than he was when he was at the bottom of the pillar of light, even though he just swam up what is essentially a waterfall of curse technique that is specifically created to kill him. Don't worry, we get a I guess you could call it an explanation, because as Angel, who's in Hana's body, remember, is seeing Sukuna swim up this waterfall like a salmon trying to get to mating grounds, Angel yells out of Hana's face, "Hana, fall back for a moment." It's a little too late because Sukuna is already behind Hana and loaded up a big boy punch. And while he's loading up this big boy punch, he's thinking to himself, they're coexisting within that body, which means they're reliant on each other's curse techniques, and therefore they have no physical toughness as a sorcerer. Sukuna then continues on by saying losing one of their arms only made that fact all the more true. And it's at this point that it's revealed why Sukuna was able to swim up the Jacob's Ladder, because apparently Hana losing one of her arms stops her from being able to use maximum output Jacob's Ladder at its full power. As Sukuna tells us, they weren't able to garner the same output as they did back then, which I mean, it is an explanation. It's never once been established that Hana needed both of her arms to use maximum output Jacob's Ladder at its full power, and there's really no reason for us to believe that that would be the situation. Like, how does Todo, a person whose boogie woogie depends on him clapping, come back with a stronger boogie woogie after losing an arm, and yet Hana, whose curse technique is holding a trumpet and blowing, comes back with a weaker Jacob's Ladder because she only has one arm? Are you telling me that the strength of her Jacob's Ladder was in her biceps? That'd be like saying, oh, Inamaki's curse speech is now weaker because he lost an arm. That doesn't make sense. Like, if you wanted to say that she was still weakened from her recovery of losing an arm, then yes, absolutely, that works. She was grievously injured. She was in a hospital bed when the Kusakabe Coalition came to her asking her to help in the battle. But why on God's green earth would Hana and Angel having one arm stop them from using a maximum output Jacob's Ladder at full power? It's so dumb. But don't worry, Sukuna doesn't achieve his goal of killing Hana, because right as Sukuna is about to land what would be a killing blow on Hana, one of the rocks from the debris that Sukuna kicked up with his punch, I guess I should say punched up with his punch, turns into Todo, who tanks the black flash that Sukuna was about to land on Hana. Now, as to whether or not this was just Todo jumping up or using his boogie woogie, I can't be entirely sure because my leaks aren't great. If any of us remember correctly, 2 weeks ago when Chapter 263 came out, we'll remember that supposedly the final Boogie Woogie swap that Todo was ever going to be able to do, at least with his Vibra Slap, was the switch that got Hana in position to fire off her maximum output Jacob's Ladder. This is why when Todo goes to slam the metal part of the Vibra Slap down on the ground, he's saying, don't fail me one more time. However, Yuji doesn't swap positions, and thus Sukuna believes that Boogie Woogie has failed. But no, it hasn't failed. In actuality, the final swap that Todo was making with his boogie woogie was putting Hana in position. And this is all explained to us through the exposition at the end of the chapter, where Yuta is talking about how the strength of his copy technique is also having the original user of the curse technique on the battlefield fighting the same fight. And yet Todo shows up directly in front of Hana and tanks, once again, Sukuna's next Black Flash. So I guess we kind of have to assume that he used boogie woogie, but as to how he did it, genuinely, I have no clue. And unfortunately, it only gets more confusing after Todo tanks this Black Flash. Because after Sukuna hits Todo with this Black Flash, we see the two of them smiling at each other. And we can see that there is absolutely nothing attached to Todo's stump hand. Not the metal part or the wooden part of the Vibra Slap. It's just a stump. And thus, so far as I can tell, Todo doesn't have any way to use Boogie Woogie anymore. I'm assuming somehow, some way, Todo was able to use Boogie Woogie one final time for the second time and get in front of Sukuna's Black Flash. Now, this obviously confuses and perplexes Sukuna, who thinks to himself after he punches Todo with his Black Flash that this man, down to his very core, is a jujitsu sorcerer. And quite honestly, I tend to think the same. And I would completely understand why Sukuna thinks that, because if there's one person in this story who gives Sukuna a run for his money in terms of inexplicable power-ups, it's Todo. But after they have this manly showdown, Sukuna downspikes Todo like Mario the second you get off map, and laser beams him through 2 buildings until eventually he finds his resting point 2 blocks away, laid flat out on his back. And it appears at this point that Hana and Todo have been completely incapacitated and taken out of the fight. But more likely than not, both of them are still alive. At least Hana is still alive. There'd be no point in Todo taking the Black Flash for her if she wasn't going to survive the punch. But this is rather interesting, because Hana would only be kept alive for one of 2 reasons. The first reason is that Gege wants her to make it to the end of the manga, so that possibly she can get married to Megami or something like that. And the second reason is that her usefulness in this fight is not quite yet over. Outside of the confines of those 2 reasons, there's really no reason to keep Hana/Angel alive. And thus either I'm predicting we'll either see her once again in this battle, or she'll make it to the end of the story. All that's truly important at this moment in time, though, this is something that Sukuna tells us, is that Todo and Angel are out of the fight. And Sukuna says this to himself after saying that he can snuff out Angel's final breath later. But Sukuna comes to the realization that the only person left standing is the brat, or Yuji. However, it's this point that Sukuna realizes that Yuji chased him up the Jacob's Ladder, as Yuji is right behind Sukuna. And it's at this point that we get a little chibi drawing of Yuji following Sukuna up the debris of the Jacob's Ladder. And thus the fight has become airborne, at least temporarily. And thus Yuji hits Sukuna with a right of a lifetime, grabs his feet, and throws him like a steel chair in a cage match through the building below them. Now naturally, this isn't even enough to injure Sukuna, who lands on his feet after being thrown through a building. And not only does he land on his feet after being thrown through 14 stories of patios, but he also has the wherewithal to realize that Yuji is once again closing in on him. And thus we see Sukuna dodge and Yuji appear out of the blue. And where Sukuna Sukuna was previously standing, we see Yuji casting a dismantle on the ground. Now, this dismantle was obviously meant for Sukuna. As like we've already said, Yuji has narrowed the usefulness of dismantle down to specifically target the barrier between Sukuna and Megami's souls, which is why when Yuji uses dismantle on really anything else, it's so much less useful than Sukuna's, which is why the scissor marks appear on the ground and why it takes a second for Yuji to cut anything, and also why he has to touch what he's cutting. And missing Sukuna is not great for Yuji, because as Sukuna is dodging Yuji, Yuji sees a fist come in. However, this fist is coming from Sukuna's left side. I don't know if you guys remember, but Sukuna doesn't have any fists on his left side anymore. You know, except for like now, apparently. Because wouldn't you know it, by unleashing that black flash on Todo, Sukuna has recovered his reverse curse technique, completely ignoring the fact that Yuji just 14 seconds earlier socked him in the face, grabbed him by the feet, and threw him through a building. And say it with me, guys, every time that Yuji punches Sukuna is supposed to reset how he recovers through the usage of black flashes. Yuji's main ability that was highlighted about 10 chapters ago was the ability to stop Sukuna's momentum. And yet, momentum. But Nick, it was only one punch. Okay, but I just don't get why we make rules just to immediately throw them out the window. And Nick, this was 2 black flashes in a row. Yeah, I guess it kind of was, but we're also ignoring the fact that last chapter, Yuji hit a dismantle between the barrier of Megami and Sukuna's souls. That was so incredibly powerful that it made Sukuna puke up fingers. So I don't think this is 2 black flashes in a row. No, in fact, I think it's 1 black flash. Because if Yuji just punching Sukuna is supposed to stop his momentum and his ability to recover his RCT and blown out techniques, then him hitting him with a dismantle that targets the barrier between his and Megami's souls so hard that he pukes up fingers should put him back at 0. Which means that Sukuna hit 1 black flash and then was punched in the face by Yuji, which is also supposed to stop his momentum. And yet, RCT. Listen, I understand the hype of this chapter, and I, by and large, have enjoyed this chapter. It's just that Gege creates rules and then immediately throws them out the window. And it's like, just don't make the rules. But anyway, Sukuna, with his now newly formed left hand, socks Yuji straight in the face, which sends him reeling backwards. And it's at this point that it's revealed that not only did Sukuna get his hands back, but he also healed his heart and his mouth. And by his mouth, I mean his stomach mouth, which means he can now use things like his world-cutting slash. He doesn't have to worry about constantly keeping his heart pumping, and his stomach mouth can do all the chants he needs, while his upstairs mouth does all the bad mouthing of Yuji. And thus, for all intents and purposes, once again, Sukuna is at full strength, and he proceeds to show that full strength to Yuji, landing a strong knee in Yuji's chin. And after doing it, Sukuna thinks to himself, there's no need for me to make risky moves like Gojo did, referring to how it was risky for Gojo to risk his life for black flashes and use purples to explode both him and Sukuna, because Sukuna was aware of the fact that he'd be able to land black flashes and recover his strength and his RCT eventually. However, as Sukuna is thinking this and is once again trying to close the distance between him and Yuji, Yuji uses dismantle on the ground and makes Sukuna slip. Yuji then throws a right punch, which Sukuna catches with one of his left hands, and Sukuna delivers 2 hard punches with his 2 right hands to Yuji's side and head. All the while thinking, I can take my time to allow my burnt out techniques to recover, Yuji stands no threat against my life. That is to say that Sukuna isn't going to try to use reverse curse technique on the part of his brain that controls curse techniques, something that eventually led to Gojo and Sukuna gaining enough brain damage that neither of them were able to use curse techniques for a certain amount of time. And all the while Sukuna is thinking this, Yuji is trying to land a dismantle on him, but he keeps missing. All the while Sukuna thinks a dismantle targeted at the barrier between me and Megami's souls would be deadly to a reincarnated person like myself. However, it's not deadly if it doesn't hit me, he thinks as he lands a hard right to Yuji's face. And yet Yuji still stands, and he wipes the blood from his lip. And as they make eye contact, the final panel on this page shows Sukuna's eyes, alert, or even possibly scared, as we get our first flashback in what's felt like forever to chapter 15, the chapter where Jogo opened his domain in a battle against Gojo. And it was in this chapter that for the first time, we saw domain expansions. And it was at this point that Gojo explained to us the added benefits of using a domain expansion. See, Gojo explained in this chapter that using a domain expansion burns up a ton of cursed energy, but it has its merits. First, you get a stat boost due to the change in environment, sort of like a buff in a video game. But you also get a guaranteed hit factor. And it's at this point that we see Yuji clasp his 2 hands together and say, Yoichi Tenkai, also known in English as domain expansion. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm getting goosebumps just talking about it. Yuji opens his domain. And it's not somebody else's domain, no, because Yuji uses his own hand sign. A hand sign that has him interlock his fingers and keep his middle fingers up. And this is actually harder than it looks. Like, actually, do this at home and try and keep your middle fingers apart. It's actually like a workout. Now, we don't get the name of Yuji's domain expansion, and therefore I can't officially call it left, right, good night, but that's what it appears to be, because on the next page, after we see Yuji do his unique hand sign and say domain expansion, we see Sukuna in Yuji's body awaken. But Nick, what does this mean? Does this mean that Yuji's domain expansion put Sukuna back in him? No. See, it's this point that the narrator tells us, through switch training with Kusakabe, that Yuji learned the basics of barrier techniques. Now, I'll tell you right now, I don't think the basics of barrier techniques are a domain expansion so powerful you try to use it on the strongest thing that's ever existed, but sure. Go off, King. See, because all we had known about Yuji's switch training with Kusakabe is that it had really been done in order to make sure that Yuji had a defense against the opening of other people's domains. However, for Yuji to make it to the end of the story without opening a domain expansion of his own would have felt criminal. And fans have been clamoring for Yuji to get his own domain expansion for what feels like forever. And while Yuji was able to make a simple domain when Sukuna opened his domain expansion on him 10 or 15 chapters ago, it was stripped away so quickly and completely it kind of felt like he wasn't great at barrier techniques. And yet, here we are. And where is here, you ask? Well, it appears to be a train station. And here's the thing. I have a feeling deep in my soul that I'm like 99% sure of that this train station comes from an important part of the story. As to whether it's supposed to be Shibuya or somewhere else keenly important to Yuji's character development, I can't necessarily say because it doesn't look hugely familiar to me and I don't have every single train station in Tokyo memorized. But there does appear to be a sign over one of the tracks that says track 10. And as Shibuya's train station is one of the biggest train stations in all of Japan, let alone Tokyo, it's one of the few train stations where you would see 10 tracks. So it could be the Shibuya train station. Regardless, Sukuna awakes once again in Yuji's body and looks up and sees Yuji walking towards him. At which point Sukuna asks, "What is this?" And it's at this point that a fully healed Yuji looks down at Sukuna, who's sitting on a bench, and says, "Come on, Sukuna, let's go." While Sukuna, once again in Yuji's body, staring at Yuji's body, looks up in abject horror. And thus the battle in Yuji's domain takes place in the next chapter, which I'm assuming is next week on account of the fact that this chapter doesn't end with saying that Gege is going on a break. So in 7 days' time, we'll know how this battle starts and possibly how Yuji's domain works. But if I could venture a guess, I'd reckon that Yuji's domain works in the way that a lot of us have anticipated it's going to work for a long time now. That is to say that the innate technique applied to the barrier of Yuji's domain expansion would most likely be something like dismantle. However, that innate technique is only applied whenever Yuji comes into contact with somebody else. And thus every single time that Yuji punch, kicks, or throws Sukuna into what I assume will be their 1v1 boxing match they're about to have, the dismantle that targets the barrier between Megami and Sukuna's souls will be activated. But then Nick, why is Sukuna once again in Yuji's body? Well, if I had to hypothesize, it's to even the stats. But who am I to say, at least right now? Hypothesizing and theorizing about what Yuji's domain expansion might be deserves its entire own video. I haven't had enough time to digest what happened in this chapter, and I also think some of you might have some good ideas. And thus, next Wednesday, after I've had some time to sit on what Yuji's domain expansion might actually be, and also had time to talk to you guys with your well-informed and well-curated theories, well, at that point, I'll sit down and do a big old video theorizing on what Yuji's possible domain expansion might be. And maybe we'll be right, or we could be massively wrong. Though when it comes to JJK, more often than not, I am right. And thus this chapter ended in one of the most hype and positive ways that any chapter has ended in the entirety of the Sukuna cycle. And thus, my mixed emotions. And see, here's the thing. I know that there's some of you who have either already typed out or are about to type out a mean comment about how much I hate JJK, and if I hate it so much, I shouldn't read it. But my relationship with JJK could not be further from the opposite. I adore this manga. I would read another 450 chapters of this manga. This manga is one of my favorite mangas of all time. The ups and downs, the unexpected twists and turns, the loss of key and beloved characters, Yuji's historic rise from almost useless to the most useful person in the universe. JJK is not only a masterclass in manga writing, but it's also so good it's rewired how several mangas around it have finished their stories. The standard has been changed so drastically by JJK's dour approach to a shonen manga that manga like MAJ that refused to kill off characters of any import really lost any and all momentum. And that's the true beauty of JJK. It's so good, it's warped what manga fans want. So why am I so critical of this manga? Because I love it, because I understand it, because I want it to end perfectly. And one of the greatest things about this manga is the power system and how, like Nen, it had rules. And not only rules, but highly specific rules. Highly specific rules that if you knew enough about, you could find out ways to make a weak character incredibly powerful. And yet over the course of the last couple of chapters, we've been Demon Slayerifying the manga, introducing rules and consequences that don't appear to matter. Therefore, while I'm absolutely thrilled with the result of this chapter, I mean, Yuji just unlocked his domain expansion. He's now locked in a 1v1 with Sukuna in a train station. It's everything I and the rest of the fan base has wanted for the entirety of JJK. I've been incredibly outspoken about the fact that the only person that I think should defeat Sukuna is Yuji, and thus Yuji now being placed in an actual 1v1 with the rest of the world knocked out unconscious or cut in half is exactly how I wanted this story to end. I wanted Yuji to slowly claw his way up the ranks of strength until eventually he was the only person left on Earth who could battle it out against Sukuna. And that is, by the looks of this domain expansion, exactly what we have. A battle between the two of them with equal stats, with both of them healed and healthy, where Yuji is finally gonna be able to exorcise this cursed spirit that's been haunting his life for the last year. That is perfect. But it doesn't mean I have to love how we got here. And how we got here was, quite frankly, a lot of malarkey. That's the unfortunate aspect of all of this. I continued to introduce new rule after new rule, and eventually apparently just lost track of those rules. Binding vows became something you can do whenever it's convenient, and since the penalty of breaking a binding vow with yourself is just losing whatever you gained through that binding vow, there was no consequences to any of these binding vows. Toto returned with a vibra slap on his hand that made his boogie woogie stronger, and then lost part of that vibra slap, could still use it, and then lost the other part of that vibra slap and could still use it. On his maximum output, Jacob's ladder was strong enough to almost kill Sukuna twice, but in the third time that she used it against possibly the weakest version of Sukuna Megami combination we'd ever seen, he was able to climb up it because she'd lost an arm, and for some reason Sukuna is able to land a black flash every single chapter. Listen, I get it. What we wanted from the story was for every single member of the Kusakabe coalition to slowly be whittled down until eventually it was down to Yuji, and for Yuji, who was constantly belittled by Sukuna, to finally be the person who clutches up in battle against him. But I can't help but feel like we could have gotten to this point with less ass pulls. But now that we're here, I genuinely can't complain. And thus, like with so many chapters in the Sukuna cycle, wow, did this chapter end incredibly, and wow, did I hate a lot of the things that happened in it. And thus, once again, JJK has its fangs in me, and I'll be fiending for another chapter just like I was this week around this time next week. And that's the beauty of JJK. No matter how mad you get at it, you're never gonna drop it. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. What did you think about this chapter, and what do you believe Yuji's domain expansion is? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go take 17 Dayquil and try to feel better.